Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to 24 Magazine by 7 Magazine's webinar, From Contract Management to Contract Mastery, Aligning Service Strategies with Goals, sponsored by PartSource. I'm Carrie Forsyth-Stevens, the editor of 24/7 Magazine and your host for today. I'm joined by two distinguished speakers, Joan Reed, Vice President of Service Solutions at PartSource, and Dallas Sutton, Manager of Clinical Engineering at WakeMed Health and Hospitals in North Carolina. Both are experts in healthcare technology management. Joan brings over 30 years of experience in commercial services, equipment leadership, and strategic portfolio management in healthcare and financial services, while Dallas has over 30 years of HTM experience, including roles in the U.S. Air Force and the Department of Veterans Affairs. After the presentation, Joan and Dallas will answer as many questions as possible. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers, Joan and Dallas.
Hello, this is Dallas. I'm going to start off this just with a quick disclaimer about our relationship with PartSource. This, although being sponsored by PartSource, is not meant as a sales pitch, but rather to illustrate the benefits of having a partner in a strategic approach to contracting, or if not, if that's what's warranted. Having a contract does not mean you have to have a contract with the OEM or a single third party. And there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of both. WakeMed is also a PartSource Pro customer and currently partnered with PartSource on a few different contracts, which I'll use as examples as we go through the presentation, not to sell PartSource, but rather because they are working for me. All right. So in my observation, regardless of your organization type, you must outsource some activity to those with more time, more experience, or more resources. Our goal is to make the best choice for our respective organizations. So since we all need some level of contract support, which will end up being your service strategy, what does this mean and how do you develop and optimize it? Where does your team fit into your service plan and how do we get there?
So thank you, Dallas. This is Joan. Today we're going to cover how to look at the scope of your service agreements and really get some best practices on optimizing your contract and service strategies that work for you, because every in-house organization is different. We'll talk about integrating your capabilities into your service strategy so that you can get the best outcome of your department. And we'll also talk about managing change, because this is a lot of change for an organization to absorb. And how do you work through change management with the strategic leaders within your organization? And finally, we're going to also touch on end of service life assets, because they exist everywhere in every hospital and they have come with some unique needs. And we may have some options for you within end of service life assets.
All right, so when we start looking at the type of assets we're considering here, most of the time we're looking at mission critical, and that's going to really be up to you guys to decide what you're considering mission critical. Most places that's going to be like some sort of imaging device, CT, MR, PET scanner, cath lab. But in any case, it's going to be something that is critical to your business. If you have a anesthesia machine go down, that's mission critical if I'm shutting an OR down. So there's lots of that consideration needs to be made personally by your organization. But what are our options in supporting what we're going to consider mission critical devices? There's always OEM, there's third party, there's in-house, time and material, or some combination therein. In general, how do these service options rank in terms of cost? Essentially, it's about the same, OEM, third party, in-house, D&M, and then the combination. So when we start considering those different options, how does risk vary in each type of service approach? What are the types of risks that we're considering? Safety, safety of the device and the patient. Satisfaction, patient satisfaction, of course, but then there's physician and clinical satisfaction, financial, response time, penalty for using other service providers, etc. Joan?
Yeah, so everything that Dallas had mentioned is something that we took consideration on. In 2014, we studied parts procurement, which identified some widespread issues in the HTM space. And it started with a lack of data-driven decision-making. There was also inefficiency and no transparent insights into parts procurement. After we did that study, we developed PartSource Pro, which delivers quality, cost, and productivity through our enterprise platform. It uses precision procurement, benchmark data and analytics, and ultimately community buying power. Once we completed that study, in 2022, we turned to service agreements because it's a much larger component of the HTM budget. And utilizing our primary research and extensive analysis of over 35 million data points over 20 years of service data, we found that many of the same issues that existed in parts also existed in service agreements, but with much bigger implications. So here's what we found. We found that equipment contracts are the largest single line in your budget, roughly making up at least 50% of the HTM budget. The average health system manages and negotiates more than 146 service contracts, and each one will take as long as 3 to 4 months to negotiate. Furthermore, when the agreement comes up for renewal, our customers lacked the quality metrics to measure the overall performance or effectiveness of the agreement. And roughly 75% of service agreements are low dollar amount. That means you're spending a lot of time negotiating very low dollar contracts, taking your team away from more productive use of their time. So we also polled systems and found that over 90% of hospitals do not have the systems or tools that they feel are important to evaluate the performance of their current vendors against their contract terms. And having one contract approach over another did not necessarily correlate to that clinical risk that Dallas mentioned wanting to mitigate. We also found a lot of pricing variability. When we looked at same make and model assets with the same contract level, we found variation in pricing with sometimes as much as a 57% variation, which was huge. Once we identified these problems, we started thinking about ways to solve them. So understanding the challenges that we had in the service contracts and the value we could unlock from addressing them, we asked ourselves, what would the ideal solution look like for our customers to activate a new service model? And this is where we started thinking outside the box with a more disruptive approach to service. And again, to Dallas's point, this is not a sales presentation. This is just simply one approach as you think through how is the best way to service the assets in your health system. But we asked ourselves, after looking at the data, what if we were able to reimagine the entire process end to end? And we leverage our data and evidence to first capture immediate savings, two, maximize clinical availability that improves patient care and provides a strategic roadmap to allow you to unlock and advance your in-house capabilities. So this is how we look at service management. First, we rationalize contracts, again, using that database that we've put together into a single managed agreement. And that provides unmatched flexibility and time savings. The output is not just simply a single managed service agreement, but it's also a multi-year roadmap for transitioning off contract, which includes the staffing that you have both today and what you may need in the future, the training that would be needed with that, and service provider recommendations. We eliminate truly the chaos of managing multiple service events and vendors through this standardized workflow that we've stood up. And we do active event and vendor management, which is really key, in our opinion, to finding that you're delivering the best quality service, both for your clinicians and to improve the patient care. Third, we monitor vendor performance. We hold the vendors that we use accountable and proactively recommend evidence-based alternatives to improve the quality of that service event. We also reduce costs on service contracts through that data and reduce that variance that we talked about, that we learned within our study. And finally, we digitize the entire process so that it not only reduces the work, but it provides really great, rich, transparent data that you need to more efficiently manage your operations. So this is just one example of what we're doing with HTMs across the country. Dallas will show you some key steps to consider when approaching a new service model.
Yeah, so this, I'm sorry, this, back to that slide, we were looking at, I've been in WakeMed for about 15 years, and I've been able to, in that time period, I was able to bring in-house CT, nuke med, and MR. We already had cath lab, angio, mammo, mobile, C-arm, and stuff like that. But be able to bring it in, I can actually quantify each one of these columns with what we did. Most recently, with partnering with PartSource, I was able to right size a ultrasound contract that had been identified as having a fleet of one third of my fleet being end of life into support. So by partnering with PartSource, I was actually able to reduce my contract cost for that fleet by 50%. So it was 100% accurate, that statement there. As far as improved patient care, I was able to maintain the fleet that 25% of my inventory is supposed to be into life into support, and able to keep them. And now 1 year into the contract, it's proven to be true that we were able to not only increase the service offering, i.e. the vendor that we were using before did not have weekend service, couldn't order parts. I'm able to do that now. I have third-party backup support, and I also have a fleet that I was going to have to retire that is now serviceable. And then as far as demonstrating value, yeah, when I'm able to communicate to leadership that I'm able to offset $1.4 million worth of capital because of our relationship and a different approach to service, that pays the bills there. So we're 1 year into the service model. I just renewed it, and very happy with that process so far. But it has to do with making those strategic adjustments to your contracts to maybe shift away from the OEM where it's applicable. All right. This one, start looking at consolidating contracts in your hospital. Somewhat embarrassing to say, but we, we're feel pretty confident on most of the devices out in our facility as far as the medical equipment inventory that they're managed by clinical engineering. But when I first got here, that wasn't necessarily the case. So the question would be for you guys is, are there any medical equipment contracts out there that aren't being managed by your department? I would ask how that is working. What are you doing about getting service reports and making sure that the standard of service is being upheld, your stickers are getting updated, and so on and so forth? Are you involved in those decisions to renew those contracts? Do you have the ability to pull a modality in-house if you choose to? How do you manage, regulatory requirements? So this slide's really about taking ownership of the entire support strategy for your inventory, centralization of contract management, your standardization of your service approach, having coterminous contract start and stop dates, uniform vendor management, equity of service pricing, volume discounting, and shedding dead weight off of your contracts. I know that one situation we had facilities management or facilities engineering would do the installation of the surgical lights. And it was a presumption that they were maintaining the surgical lights. And we come to find out that while they would support them occasionally, the contract was actually owned by surgery. And so through that process, we decided, no, we need to standardize the service approach as well as standardize the inventory, because we found out people were buying different equipment in different locations. So it's really about trying to get a uniform approach to that. And once we start having ownership of that, you're able to communicate to executive leadership on the financial impact of what's going on with your inventory, with the service contracts. You're able to maintain a certain level of service quality and demonstrate the value of your department and justifying requests for additional in-house resources. If you know that if you have a visibility to the contract status of some particular modality, OR table, surgical lights, something that's not being captured, and you can use that to justify additional resources for you, or at least reduce contract costs system-wide, it's a feather in your department's cap for that. It also gives you the ability to provide executive leadership a more complete picture on real capital needs. All right, so on this one, I mentioned earlier, WakeMed makes every effort to support all of our modalities in-house. And this, this is talking about starting with low risk modalities, or if you already have incorporated some low risk modalities, keep going. It's how do you continue that momentum when you start bringing stuff in-house? But when you start talking about bringing something in-house, if you're not there, what are some things you need to worry about, or things you need to think about? So common examples of stuff that you might start with: ultrasound, C-arms, dental, portable, stuff like that, lower end, lesser impact. And I say that, of course, if you're an ultrasound department with one ultrasound, then yeah, that's pretty impactful, but we're not talking about something necessarily that's going to put your site on diversion like a CT. So some things to think about. It says here location. You start talking about where you are in locale to the device you're wanting to bring in-house and support. These are the stuff on the board here are really commonality, common things you would think of: service histories and redundancy. But some of the stuff that I added in my notes here are your vacancies. If you're having trouble hiring somebody to support your existing inventory, it's going to be somewhat difficult to add to that workload. Of course, you can also use that to justify additional staffing if you can moderate that with reduced contract costs. Another thing, training costs. How much does it actually cost to train a modality? What makes sense when you want to bring a modality in-house? In my experience, when you start talking about big iron, it's kind of hard to justify the expense of training and the expense of hiring additional staff for one modality. It's almost better to contract it out at times. How many people do you train? When you start looking at supporting big iron devices where you're having to worry about call schedules and things like that, how many people do you train? What is your support plan if that person you train is on PTO, vacation, or out at training? Are you using this to justify additional salaries for your staffs, right? But in the end run, people aren't really, your clinical leaders are more concerned about, do I have my equipment available to me? And when you start trying to crack that nut, I guess, is you start with those lower end modalities. All right, so when you start looking at some of the data related to your current cost and if you're able to make a change, when you look at your current contracts, how do you know you're getting a good deal, right? Are you using, third-party tools like ECRI or a peer partner like PartSource as a sounding board when you're getting those quotes? You can have conversations at regional seminars, talk to your peers down the street. I found that, when you start talking clinical engineering leader or HTM leader to HTM leader, we're not really competitors, right? We're more all in it for the patient. So have those conversations to see, kind of where you're getting that benchmark data. But if you're really trying to look at a partner that's going to have that fresh insight, you've talked to your neighbor down the street, they've got their pricing. When you start talking to somebody like PartSource, you're going to have people with like a nation's pricing. They may not have exact pricing, but it's going to be a better comparative structure for you. You can look at things like out clauses. How do you get out of a contract? What are the penalties for that? And a big one there is a service history in your CMS, trying to determine whether you actually need a contract or what type of contract to go with. Some of the stuff I made notes on here, what's your parts consumption? What kind of parts are you going through? Internal versus external labor consumption. So when do you start looking at who's doing the work? If you have an in-house or a first look device, how much are you spending on in-house support versus external support to make the determination? Well, maybe I need to train somebody. Maybe I need to train somebody else. Maybe I need to outsource this completely, right? Internal, external response time. This could be a real good justification as to how you sell this to your executive leadership. If your in-house response time is 15 minutes and the next best thing from a vendor is 4 hours, you got a pretty good selling point. When you start looking at contract cost versus the actual cost of labor and actual cost of parts, right? Non-value adds, things like remote diagnostics that you're not using, or remote diagnostics that have never prevented an on-site response. They're not really doing you any good if it's not actually preventing on-site response. And how you're calculating downtime, non-available time. What does it cost to transport a patient on diversion? And then end of life and support statuses on your contracts. So you got to consider all these things when you start making those decisions as to what to bring in, when to bring it in, how much to bring it in. And it kind of helps with your capital planning as well. All right, so this one's about monitoring, measuring, and reporting. Big takeaway here is about the automation of analytics and not entering into an OEM service contract without serious consideration. When you consider cost of service and what's actually being done, uptime, availability, you can get those wonderful contracts that say we've got a 98% uptime that still ends up being 2.5 days a week for a CT, or 2.5 days a month for a CT being down. Not very translatable into patient care as being a benefit, right? So when you consider automated analytics, I mean, for most of us, if we're just running a CMMS, you might get an ROI calculator or a downtime calculator, but you're basically comparing it against your own data. But what would be the value of a measurement tool that compares nationwide data from a partner like PartSource? So I don't claim to be an expert in anything, but when I was looking into an ultrasound solution, I didn't want to lean out my contracts too much, right? You want to leave some padding there just in case. But so what I did is I had received a quote for an expiring 5-year agreement, and that agreement indicated that 1/3 of my inventory was going to EOS after the first year of the contract. So I reached out to PartSource and asked them what my solutions were, and they started looking at the contract, did some analytics, and came back and told me that my probe pool was too big. It was part of the problem. I was given a probe pool from my OEM, and pretty much led to believe that okay, that's what you need, that's what's gonna, that's the deal, that's the cherry there, and ended up being not necessarily the case. I ended up with a lot of waste there, and was able to cut a lot of information relying on PartSource's data. And like I said, 1 year into the contract, and it proved out to be 100% true. So you don't necessarily want to rely on the OEM when you're going through a lot of this data. Another thing they did for me is, just using their data, and this is on a completely different project. It advised me to cancel coverage that I had through them on some other modalities because I wasn't using it. It wasn't effective. So it's nice to have a partner that'll tell you the truth about where you don't need to be spending money. All right. So internal competencies, like I said, I started off here as a cath lab engineer, became supervisor, became manager, and we had some internal competencies. We were supporting some things in-house, some things we were kind of fumbling through. But where do you get your biggest bang for your buck? It's of course going to be in the big irons and your response times, things like that. But when you got to start considering your approach into getting into bringing modalities in-house, you're looking for that biggest bang for your buck. Easiest to convert to in-house support, easiest to support, those are your big winners to get you going. Response times, or in my case, end of life, end of support issues, or just problematic OEMs. Some regions struggle. Some OEMs struggle in some regions with some modalities, and it's just a matter of staffing and support and those type of things. So what are some things you need to consider? I made a list of stuff that I think about when I'm considering bringing in a modality. Things like bandwidth for training for current staff. If my staff's already tapped out, do I got time to send them to school for 6 weeks, or however long it takes to finish a particular course of training? So I send them to training and I bring them back. Do I actually got time to do the work, right? What is the actual workload associated with different modalities to take on certain things? Some of that's fairly easy to figure out. What is the PM workload for a particular modality? If you've got 10 cath labs and you send somebody to school for it, well, you automatically increase their workload by X because of the number of PMs. What is the cost for training? We kind of talked about that before. Are you going to get your money out of that? Cost of service access after training is another one. So if you have a particular modality that requires, service keys and stuff like that, what's your solution to that? And there are third-party solutions to a lot of that, and there's also non-third-party but FDA required solutions, stuff like that a partner can help you navigate. End of life, end of support status. So if your normal support model is to use brand new OEM parts and the device is going into life, into support, but capital doesn't support replacing it, now you're at the point, okay, what am I doing about third-party support for both my parts, possibly labor, those type of things. Another big one is, when you start looking at number of devices in the inventory to support, sometimes it's hard to justify sending somebody to training and set up an on-call model for a single device. Number of staff members to train, and that has to do with basically on call. If I'm going to start pulling call for a device, how many people do I need to train, right? And how does that look from a like if you have 10 CT scanners and you've got 6 rad engineers, are you going to train all 6 of them on CT, or are you going to train 1 or 2 of them and then do some peer-based training there to support that? Third party versus OEM training, how do is there an opportunity to train at a lesser rate with just as high a quality using a third party? And then the biggest thing, whenever you're going to start thinking about bringing things in-house, as you are building your competency and you're building your skill set and you're training your staff, what's your backup plan? And in my mind, I like to have both a secondary and a tertiary backup plan. So I might be the first one to, as my team might be the first to respond. But if somebody's on vacation, somebody's sick, they get in over their head, what's my plan for backup to that? And I like to have written agreements for those. So But that's building internal competency. That's kind of the way to go there.
Yeah, I would add a few things that Dallas had mentioned here. This is a hard thing to do on your own, right? Building this multi-phase plan, like when you look at this slide, it's really so many moving pieces. And if you find a partner that you can work with that can be objective in the approach, it makes it a bit easier. And there are plenty of folks out there who are well versed in doing this. I would just add to what Dallas described is that he came to PartSource to help him because we had a relationship with the parts business, and we had the data that kind of led him to the assumptions or the understanding that he believed made sense for his department. So he's already well on the journey to an in-house model. But there are many customers out there that this seems to be a really big undertaking. And so you have to ask yourselves, how do I start? Where do I begin? And so he's given you a lot of really great insights on where to begin and how to start. I would just say that, we have been for many years a partner in bringing forward evidence-based solutions. That's why we started right with the data analysis that we did. We also recognize that hospitals are under just such extreme pressure these days between the resource pressures and the complexity of equipment and the cost-cutting measures that are going on. So how do you solve this problem when you're being asked to do more? And so building out the roadmap or the plan, I think, brings you peace of mind that you do have a plan or a project to work towards with your in-house organization. So whether you're well down the path like Dallas is, or you're just starting out, think through, what data do I have at my disposal? How am I going to build this plan effectively? And then can I go it alone, or do I have to partner with somebody to bring in some additional data? Because it is hard, but the outcome is significant cost savings and really getting to that point where you can be self-sustaining. And by saving the money that you're saving through maybe going in-house and removing some contracts, you're able to take that savings and reinvest it in your department so that you can grow and really continue to work that engine so that you're delivering the quality care that your patients and clinicians are looking for.
All right, so how do you get there? And it's kind of what Joan was talking about. If you're contracting service or supplementing contractor service or taking some sort of contract, how do you sell this to your customer? How do you go to your customers and kind of, I don't say convince them, but win them to the in-house support model? And then, secondary to that, how do you sell it to your technical staff? You're also changing their lives. And most of the time, a technical team's looking for that opportunity. But it's much easier to try to get buy-in if you have some sort of established good relationship and respect from your customers. If they trust you with certain modalities, it's a good idea that they'll be able to try to trust you with other modalities. And then when you start looking at your team, investing in your own internal team, save money on contracts. It can also serve to retain talent, right? So if you start putting money into people, they're going to want to stick around. You got to pay them, you got to give them the right work environments. You don't want to train them and have them bail, but at the same time, they gain a lot of respect and admiration being that support model for that critical modality. And when you start using those team members that your customers are already familiar with and they already like, more inclined to trust the success of a new plan. So when you think about creative contracting, you want to start small. You look for those. You may start with a first look contract on a critical modality, or you may start with a PM only contract. So that, you're getting PMs done by the OEM, but you're taking first look and then you're calling T&M support. And that's going to start to build your team's familiarity, but also build that confidence that no matter what the problem is, if you can't handle it, you're going to get somebody in there to take care of it. But then you start using that to build yourself up to a full service team, and it lets you also see what the true cost of service is going to be based on actual events, as opposed to paying for stuff that you're not actually going to use. In a relatively short amount of time, you'll have data to guide your contract decisions. So you start looking at who responds quicker to a service call in your facility. It's always the in-house team. You might not be able to fix everything first look every time, but you're going to give the confidence that when they call, somebody shows up, and that gets you a lot of hearts and minds. So where do you start if you haven't done any of these modalities? You're going to have to look at where your risks lie. Imaging leadership will feel threatened by the reduction or elimination of a contract, or worry about how long it's going to take to get your team to build competency. But you can negate a lot of this by putting the backup plans into place I talk about, having those secondary and tertiaries. And a lot of times my tertiary response would be the OEM. So I'd have a backup plan in place where I could, have some third-party resource. But then, it all broke loose, then I would, use the OEM. But using this data together from your previous service experience, your parts cost savings, using alternative parts sources, and all that revenue, increased uptime, you start to sell yourself as the premier service provider for your facility. Particularly important when you're talking about EOL, EOS. You get financially strapped organizations that are looking at, oh, you need $10 million worth of imaging equipment this year because the stuff's end of life, end of support, according to the OEM, knowing full well that you can support it for another 5 years using third-party resources. So there's plenty of opportunity for that. And that's where you start looking at service providers and backup plans using a partner like PartSource that has a much, much wider net than you do for identifying those resources, whether it be parts, labor, or whatnot. But
Yeah,
right.
I would also add here, Dallas, thank you. That's a really good point. And I can't stress enough the change management that comes along with making a change to your services. Dallas gave you lots of great examples of what he experienced going down this path. And change is hard, but it has to be addressed. And each of these stakeholders that you see here has a vested interest in maintaining quality, but while also being fiscally responsible. And so any change to a service model when quality is not suffering can be a challenge. So I just encourage you to ask yourself, if you're able to answer this question, why change? And here are some questions you can ask your stakeholders that may get them to think differently about moving off of the current model, whatever that model is. I would ask them, is the quality you're receiving aligned to the cost you're paying? How do you show that the amount of service you've received is comparative to what you've paid for that service? Are there any alternatives to service that would produce the same quality, meaning you've got trained local qualified vendors, trained in-house team that would match those response times? Because at the end of the day, folks want to make sure that the equipment is up and running, available to patients, and when it does break, that it can be fixed timely and with the right amount of quality. So those concerns can be mitigated as long as you have an understanding, to Dallas's point, a plan, not just a plan A, but a plan B and a plan C, so that you can show these leaders that you're thinking through all of those potential pitfalls and you have a plan to address them.
All right, so this end of life situation is what brought me to PartSource in this service offering. We were using them as parts, getting parts and infusion pumps and whatnot worked on, but like I said, I had a 5-year contract with a major OEM that gave me a renewal quote that basically eliminated a third of my inventory, my fleet. indicating it was end of life, end of support. And when asked, hey, can I just provide you a PO for T&M support for this stuff? The answer was no. They won't even come out and look at it. So quite frankly, that their lack of flexibility kind of torqued me off. So I was like, all right, fine, I'll take this information and go look elsewhere. Took my quote, covered up all the financial part of it, sent it to Parts Source, said, what do you think? And they weren't necessarily 100% prepared to respond, this was a year ago, with what I needed necessarily. But by the time we got done negotiating, they gave me everything I needed. So a lot of flexibility on Parts Source part in customizing solutions for these type of needs. But the bottom line is I end up saving $500,000 a year on this one contract. And I already have an in-house trained team. Most of this was parts related and probe pool related and TE probe related, that kind of thing. But the $500,000 a year is great. But the increased service strategy, I was able to switch to a vendor that would actually answer the phone on the weekends and would bring parts and show up on the weekends if I needed to for different, it's kind of rare in the ultrasound world, but it does happen. But the biggest thing is I had, like I said, $1.4 million worth of ultrasound fleet that was essentially going to be unsupportable if I was pigeonholed into using the OEM. So by using these alternative strategies, now I have my in-house team. I have a multitude, but a primary third-party service provider. I have probe coverage and an increased depth in service model, but I was able to offset $1.4 million worth of capital. So it was a win-win all the way around. And this is just one example. I've also got, I had another fleet. This was my injectors. I also got the same letter. Hey, these injectors, about $750,000 worth of injectors, end of life, end of support. I was already working on them. I wasn't even I didn't even have a contract on them, but I contacted Parts Source anyway. Wanted to get some assurance that I'd be able to get parts for these devices for the next couple of years. Was able to get a contract in that area, as well as training to increase the depth of my fleet, offset another $750,000 worth of capital. And since that time, we've just pinned, it doesn't start till December, a third agreement for some additional OEM equipment that was identified, CT, RF, and RAD equipment that is also approaching end of life, end of support, that we are also maintaining in-house. So we're able to get some glassware coverage, secondary and tertiary support model, additional training, parts, and service access. So just by, you start looking at stuff that's running out of time on a life expectancy thing, there are options for that stuff. So.
Yeah. I would just add one last thing there is end-of-life equipment is becoming more and more commonplace, as you all know. More than 50% of hospitals are saying that their capital budgets are flat for this year. Costs continue to be a challenge, and equipment can be kept longer and longer with the right model. So the question to ask yourself is, can I support this equipment? Is there a means to receive parts? Are there vendors out there that can still support me and my in-house team? Or if I choose not to go it alone, just simply cover this equipment for me. And you'll be pleasantly surprised that there are vendors out there and there are parts out there to help extend the life of these assets for as long as possible. And at some point they will have to be replaced. And the goal here is just to be thoughtful in your approach on how you decide which assets to replace first, second, third. If you can find the right piece of equipment and have that model that continues the life of it, it allows you to move that capital to something that's more urgent.
All right. So I guess the bottom line is I've had a lot of great success using OEM service. I've had a lot of great success using PM only contracts and tech support services from the OEM. But the problem is they're all more expensive than they need to be. OEMs are struggling with the same labor struggles that we are, and they're less flexible with their offerings and restrictive in the use of certain tools, service keys, and they're certainly not fond of you calling third-party support when they can't show up on time. By bringing some of these modalities in-house, you not only reduce your contract budget, but gain FSE count, hopefully. And what PartSource is offering is a customizable solution that's not tied directly to an OEM, but allows you flexibility to use the OEM if you need to, but allows you to migrate coverage as your comfort level changes. You get parts, you get high quality parts, high quality service, training as needed, and to help you bring your program in-house. And you think about it, if you can write a contract that includes training for an training for your in-house FSEs, it includes or excludes parts or glassware for selected devices or modalities. It includes service access to at your discretion, not tied to a specific OEM or tied to a specific FSE for that matter. Includes a labor pool for you calling an expert help, including the OEM when you need to. Includes probes and TE probes if applicable. Reimburses you for your labor that you invest in a service event, and help you identify third-party resources to support your team with customizable response times, and all the while being able to flex up and flex down coverage as your expertise and staffing levels change. I mean, that's kind of the way to go with this where we are in the world today with resources and capital. So
So I think now we have time for some questions, if there are some questions out there.
Yeah, we've got some great questions. The first one that I really like is, as the saying goes, nobody ever got fired for going with the OEM. How can I help assure clinicians that the move from a traditional full service contract doesn't have to be scary?
you want me to field that one?
Why don't you start, Dallas? Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure you've had.
I've used that statement. I've used that statement 100 times. But if you're a clinician and there is a certain comfort level, and hey, we're calling in the company that actually made this thing. And I think part of the understanding needs to be communicated is that I have people that work for me that used to work for those OEMs. So when you start looking at HTM professionals, they're the same people. So how do I communicate that to my clinical staff? Well, part of it is, having a service presence. What is your team doing to make themselves known as the professionals that they are? And part of that's, I don't want to say it's a personal relationship, but a professional relationship to the point where they can communicate, the training that I've been to, or I went to this training. We are trained the same way as the OEM, so on and so forth. If they see, if you have a full service contract, why not have your in-house technician there working with the OEM during a service event? That way they can see that synergy and see that relationship and understand that your team is there. And eventually that migration, they'll be able to, through training, through different types of service events, sometimes, the little wins will get you over the fence there. You start looking at, and you got a cath lab, the cath lab goes down because a foot switch is bad, or a TSO is bad, or something to that effect, and your team goes up and changes that part. Okay, now you're starting to get some credibility. So part of it is that their clinical understanding of our qualifications as in-house engineers, our relationship with the OEM and third-party vendors, that we are friendly and work together and start demonstrating our capability, with the little wins to start making those transitions.
Yeah, I would add to that, we're very objective when we look at makes, models, and what makes sense to bring in-house, what makes sense to move from a different contract model. So we certainly know that there are assets that need to stay with the OEM, that they are the best option for that piece of equipment, and we will make that recommendation very frequently. On the other hand, when I think about response time and quality, as Dallas mentioned, right, his team is trained like the OEM teams are trained. I would just ask, who is the fastest person who can respond to that service call? And I would imagine it would be the on-site engineer, because they're already there. So they will respond faster. And if they have the training ready to go, they would be the best option for you. So it really makes sense in why it's so important to build that model out based on your equipment. Do you have the training? Is somebody on site and ready to go? Is this perhaps a very unique, specialized piece of equipment that's mission critical that needs the OEM service? Those are the kinds of things that we think about when we're putting together an analysis for a customer based on our data.
Well, great, thank you. I like this question too. Okay, so my department is definitely looking to train up on new modalities so we can bring them in-house. Do I need to keep on a full service contract until they are fully trained?
What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, my experience is, the first modality that I transitioned after I became supervisor here was CT, and we had 10 CTs. Over half of those were in standalone emergency departments, meaning if they went down, that site's on diversion, right? So it's pretty critical. We had already had an established reputation with the team, but my transition was for those was actually kind of abrupt. We had a full service contract, and then I sent somebody to school who had been working with the OEM, as I stated earlier, for probably 6-8 months, and then I sent them to CT school. They came back, and I signed a tech support and service access contract with the OEM, and paid for a labor pool for backup. So basically, what I was doing was hedging my bets there. That okay, I stuck them with the OEM for 6 months or so before they went to school, so they didn't go in cold. I had a full service contract while they went to school. After the school, we made a transition date, and I worked this out with the OEM to actually reduce my service contracts with them. And it was basically a weaning of my in-house technician off of reliance for OEM support, but also a weaning of the clinical customer off of seeing the OEM there. So that process took place, and then eventually it was, they don't even know who our local CT OEM representative is, because we support it in-house completely. So.
And where we can help there as well is when we are looking at and evaluating contracts that customers are considering bringing in-house, we are aligning it to our data that we have, that 20 years of data that I mentioned earlier. And so we're able to rationalize pricing for you, because we can see where we can perhaps provide the same full service at a lower price. And so what our customers do is they select those contracts that they're interested in moving to in-house, and they start with us in this, and I'm using air quotes, full service model, because we are providing it through our vendor network. We're providing the services through our vendor network at a savings. And then what happens is the customers are able to take that savings and begin the process of training somebody. So it's basically a self-funding process, so that you can use the savings for your department to, whether it's hire an extra person, get the training, build out the tools and test equipment that you need, while we maintain that full service agreement for you. And then when you're ready, pull it down, pull it out of a service agreement into a full in-house model. So it's a really unique opportunity to do it on your own if you've got that trained in-house staff, as Dallas mentioned, one very real way to get it done. Or another option, I want to get there, but I need maybe some support or a backstop to get there.
Great. Well, I have one more question for time's sake, and I think this is a great one to end on. But whenever we talk about going off full service contract, the pushback is that we'll lose access to service keys, tech support, and clinical support. How can PartSource help us navigate these issues?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it comes up a lot. I'll start with our opinion on that, and then Dallas, I would love to hear your feedback as well. Service keys, I understand they're important. There are certain instances where you need service keys. You do need to have the service keys, the minimum service keys that are required to perform service. That means to perform preventive maintenance and corrective maintenance service. Some higher level service keys are certainly an easy button, if you will. They help you get to the diagnosis faster, or they help you, just turn the equipment over faster. So in those cases, we find that training on the equipment, you can do all of that work without the service key. Now, again, there are certain instances you do need a service key, and you need access to that key to, say, get into the software, and the OEM will be able to provide that for you. But when you want the easy button service key, you're right. Sometimes you can buy them through the OEM, sometimes you can't. So it really depends on the equipment. But I would say that our approach is better training will allow you to do the service you need without those service keys. And when you take away that piece of it, it allows you the flexibility of really changing the way that you service your equipment and no longer having that deep reliance on the OEM if you're looking to save some money.
Yeah, I can tell you that service keys was probably the single most limiting factor in me having a comfort level in transitioning to using non-OEM support. And it's for all the reasons Joan mentioned. You start worrying about, well, if I don't have a service key, I can't do this. And that's a lot of that scare tactic initiated by the OEMs, because there are federal requirements that they provide certain levels of access. And some of that access becomes a little bit more difficult to use. There may be more of a manual process, but it doesn't change the fact that you do have access to do all the testing and performance testing and calibration stuff you need to do in order to keep a system functioning. So that was one of my big questions when I approached PartSource. Was like, all right, here's what I want, but I'm scared. And the couple of, for instance, my ultrasound contract, I had full access to service keys prior to, and I did not notice a change in my ability to service my systems after the elimination of the OEM service contracts. So that was an easy one. Right now, I'm about to experience what it's like on CT, cath labs, and things like that. But I've had conversations. RSTI, in my mind, made a really good purchase with the RSTI organization, who have legal and functional paths to help you understand the use of service keys that are federally allowable. So that was another benefit of this relationship, is having them help us through the transition, help me through my pain points, to know that although I don't have a OEM service contract, I do still have access to my equipment to be able to perform the work that I need to do. That being said, if you need the easy button, you can still always go out and purchase those things. So, and on occasion, as I understand it, there are a pay per use through the OEM access to certain service keys. Like, we're going to turn on this service key. You get this service key active for 24 hours. It costs you $200 or something to that effect. So it's OEM driven. There's some different things right there, and part of that is everybody's responsibility to make their voice heard in that right to repair arena as well.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much. I want to conclude by saying thank you to our presenters who both did a wonderful job, as well as our sponsor, PartSource. Also, please email me at kstevens, and that's Stevens with the PH, at medqor.com with comments, questions, and future webinar suggestions. And be sure to visit us at www.24x7mag.com. Thank you again for participating in 24/7 Magazine's webinar, From Contract Management to Contract Mastery, Aligning Service Strategies with Goals. Have a wonderful day.